When he was 14, Hellbent was a regular in physical therapy because his knee would just dislocate randomly. Most of the staff were older and nice, but one day, Hellbent saw a cutie in sweats and a blue shirt. Hellbent decided to start flirting with every Chuck Norris joke he knew. That actually worked, and he eventually found out they went to the same church, and they grew closer to each other from there. It took months before Hellbent asked her out, but he did, and it worked. 5 years later, they're planning to move in together.
Sweet Commando's dad once had a massive party at their house, and at that party, his dad had a bit too much to drink and stripped naked. Rather than keep his nudity in the house, he kicked the fence panel down and ran through their neighbor's garden. Sweet Commando really liked his neighbors, so the whole thing made him cringe. That's why the best part was the phone call the next morning between his dad and the neighbors, talking about his drunk antics. Hellbent was having dinner with some work colleagues and there was a slight accident. He went to drink his last glass of beer when suddenly, gravity took over. He remembers falling, but nothing else. When he woke up, someone told him what happened. He fell backwards off his chair, smashed his head onto the table behind him, knocking that over, and his feet kicked forward, kicking another table over. He was dragged out the restaurant by his colleagues and remembers seeing at least 20 disgruntled patrons shaking their heads. Apparently they still talk about it around the water cooler whenever Hellbent's name is mentioned. One time, Froggy witnessed a guy piss through a letterbox. He just walked up to the door, whipped his thing out, and pissed in the letterbox. Then he got out a key and opened the door and fell into the house. So it turns out the guy pissed through his own letterbox and then fell into it. Froggy laughed about this for over an hour.
So when I was a little kid, my mother would always tell me not to swim in the local river. I was a pretty rebellious kid back then, so one day I planned it all out, man. I had swim trunks tucked in my backpack. This was going to be a great day. So after school, I ran out to the river and saw that nobody was around. Which was weird. It was going to rain, but my little kid mind did not understand that a storm was coming. I switched into my swim trunks and just dove straight into the water. For the first few minutes, everything was fine, but a strong current came in and dragged me into a deeper part of the river. I was so young, I did not understand that the best course of action was to just relax and hopefully float up. So instead, I just freaked out and flung around until I passed out. The next thing I remembered is waking up around 5 miles away from where I was swimming. It was way late, like probably around midnight. Once I somehow got back home, there were 2 police cars waiting outside of my house. Honestly, I just wanted to run away. But I went inside, and after my mom yelled at me and the cops left, I was grounded for 3 months. Between me and you guys, I can't really go into deep waters still, thanks to that. It freaked me out that badly.
Spinal Palm was holding hands with his girlfriend, Princess Proton, when suddenly, she said she needed to go to the bathroom. Spinal Palm said, okay, and thought nothing of it. About 5 minutes later, he saw her sitting under a tree, holding hands with his best friend, Salty Squid. Spinal Palm walked over to the tree to say something, but nothing came out. While he was trying to find the words, Princess Proton said, "Go away, Spinal Palm," and walked away. Spinal Palm stood there, alone under that tree, completely stunned. He still thinks about what he could have done differently, but he can't think of anything. He doesn't talk to Princess Proton or Salty Squid anymore.
Ladybot was at a football game with her older sister when she heard some old lady cheering loudly for a specific player. The lady turned and said, "Hey little girl, the number he has is my favorite number. If you didn't know that, I don't know you. Did you know?" Ladybot was so confused. She replied,
"No, I don't know."
The lady looked at her with the deadliest stare she ever saw. Suddenly she said, "Go away! Stranger danger! Call the cops!" Lady's sister looked at her weirdly and said, "Hey lady, instead of telling us to go away, how about you tell yourself that too?" The lady looked at her with the same stare she gave Ladybot. "Fine, but you will pay," she said, then walked away. But she stared at them the whole time. Luckily, they never saw or heard from her again.
When Pandora was in middle school, students would often play baseball for gym class. But Pandora and her friends didn't really like baseball, so they often sat on the bleachers instead. On this particular day, Pandora was reading her favorite manga while the girls watched the game. And suddenly one of them let out a blood-curdling scream and leapt up off the bleachers. Pandora spun around and shouted,
"What's the matter?"
While her back was turned, a baseball came flying past her head and crashed into the bleachers. She was like an inch away from an instant concussion. After this near miss, Pandora tried to go back to reading her manga, but her heart wouldn't stop racing.
Animations once had a dream where she was in the train station sitting on a bench. When she heard the train come, she got scared and hid underneath it. But when she looked at the bottom of the bench, there were centipedes and spiders crawling all over it. Then, when she looked at the train, it was Thomas the tank engine, which for some reason made her even more scared. She had the dream again, but instead of Thomas, it was Percy. Still scary.
Melissa was on a bus going to visit some family, and some guy got onto the bus who looked kind of sketchy. He sat near the back where there wasn't a lot of people. They were about 5 minutes until the next stop when the guy got up and started yelling at the seat next to him, which was empty. Melissa assumed he was high or drunk, and she just laughed at it. Then she looked back and saw him fully naked, taking a dump on the floor and then rubbing his ass on the seat. She just stopped and stared, and the guy looked at everyone and screamed, "What the fuck are you staring at, bitch? Can't you see I'm having a conversation here?" Melissa got off at the next stop and waited for the next bus. She told her family what had happened, but none of them believed her. One day, Sidious's roommate came home with a new girlfriend. That night, the three of them watched a movie together, and Sidious thought that she was pretty cool. But Sidious changed his mind the next morning. He was woken up at 7 a.m. by his roommate's girlfriend shouting hysterically. It turned out she dreamt her boyfriend had cheated on her, so she decided to push him out of bed and start screaming accusations at him. At that moment, Sidious was sure glad to be single.
Ramona has always been very flexible, so she often does weird things with her body. The weirdest thing Ramona does whenever she's alone is to pull her legs up until her feet are above her head and shove her second toe up into her nose. On a few occasions, the toe has gotten completely stuck for several hours. She has been busted with her toe up to her nose multiple times by her family, who think it's normal for her now. Once in a while she had her toes stuck, her dad just stood there, casually asking if she wanted curry for dinner. When Pandora was younger, her mother and stepdad took her to church one Sunday. She had barely been there 2 minutes when an overbearing woman grabbed Pandora by the cheeks and said,
"Oh my! You look just like your father here!"
And she mentioned towards her stepdad, who Pandora had no biological connection to at all. Once the lady let go of her face, she awkwardly smiled at her and then backed away through the crowd just in case any other crazy people latched onto.
So when I was in the 4th grade, I had a friend who did everything with me. One time we had a test in geography, and I remember I studied extremely hard for that test. So when the time came, she sat next to me, and while I was writing down my answers, she copied mine. I didn't think it was a big deal because I let her copy my work all the time. But she wasn't smart enough to change the answers a bit around so that it didn't seem like she was copying me. So the next day, the teachers came up to us and asked us, "Okay, it's clear that you have the same answers, so who copied who?" She wouldn't admit to anything, and I wasn't gonna rat on her, so they made us retake the test. The thing is, I had burned myself out from remembering the answers before that I blocked all of that shit out and completely forgot what my answers were. So in the end, she ended up having a better grade than me, and they thought that I was the one who copied her, even though it was the other way around, and I got in trouble for it.
Legna was at a grocery store once and saw a woman with a 5-year-old kid in her cart reaching up to grab some paper towels on the top shelf. She just couldn't quite reach them. A man then walked by, stopped, and reached up for the towels. Instead of handing them to the woman like Legna thought he would, he just put them in his cart and walked away, like nothing had happened. The woman just stood there for a second, wondering why the man was so rude. They went their separate ways, and he's never seen either of them again.
At Ramona's school, there was a boy in her class who always gave the dumbest excuses. It was mostly why he didn't do his homework, such as, "I have too many chores at home," or "I was doing work for other classes," or simply, "I forgot." The dumbest excuse was when he was absent for the entire day, but came to school during the final period. Ramona and the rest of the class just stared at him, wondering why he even bothered. The boy said, "Sorry I'm late. I overslept and thought it was Saturday. Also, I had to walk here, and I only ate toast for breakfast." The teacher, who wasn't buying any of it, just stared at him in disbelief. She replied with, "Oh, so that wasn't you across the street at Subway talking to your friends while eating footlongs?" Everybody giggled as he screamed, It was my twin!" The teacher was done with him and just told him to go home. After that, he didn't talk to anybody.
A very weird rule Hellbent's parents had was that he had to wear jeans whenever he went out somewhere. The only exceptions to the rule were if he was going to a friend's house or playing sports. If he disobeyed by wearing shorts or sweatpants, then he was grounded. The main reason Hellbent hated the rule so much was because jeans squeeze his junk. And it really hurt back when he went to school and had to sit in class.
The very first time I touched alcohol was in university. I'd never had it before, so I had no idea how much I could drink before actually getting drunk. For some stupid reason, I had skipped dinner that night, and my friend came over to me with a giant bottle of vodka. He put it to my lips, and I started to chug. Everyone around was so stunned that I was actually drinking that they started chanting, "Chug, chug, chug, chug," and I kept going and going until I was gone. The next thing I remember, I woke up in my bed with grass in my underwear, one contact in my eye, and no recollection of the previous night. I also had a bunch of photos on my phone with me and a bunch of people I don't remember meeting, and I had a huge cut on my knee that in hindsight I think probably could have used stitches. My friend told me that I had a contest with another girl to walk backwards down the stairs in heels. Yeah, that didn't end well. Things were going great for Doopy and her boyfriend of 2 months. Then one day, he shocked her by dropping a surprise breakup bombshell. He did this at the worst possible time, while they were in the middle of having sex. He said he was sorry and told Doopy she shouldn't cry because she was a, quote, beautiful person. Doopy was so hurt and angry that she kung fu kicked him straight out of bed. It took a long time for her to rebuild her self-esteem.
Slapped Ham has worked at 2 different fast food restaurants, so he's seen his fair share of weird and stupid customers. By far, the dumbest order he's ever had happened at his first job. An old man came in and ordered a hamburger with cheese. Since the only difference between the hamburger and the cheeseburger was the cheese, Slapped Ham just tapped the cheeseburger button. When he read the old man his order, he got all pissy that cheeseburger was typed instead of hamburger with cheese. Slapped Ham explained to him several times that a cheeseburger was a hamburger with cheese and that he'd get the exact same thing regardless, but he refused to listen. He wanted his hamburger with cheese, and he would be damned if he had to be corrected by a then 17-year-old working minimum wage. At some point, Slapped Ham was so fed up with him that he ended up going back into the order, voiding the cheeseburger and punching in a hamburger with cheese, which automatically changed to cheeseburger because apparently the register is more reasonable than an old man. Surprisingly, the old man didn't complain about his receipt showing that he had ordered a cheeseburger.
One day, when Honeybits was walking home from school, she saw a little girl staring at her. She asked, "May I help you?" The little girl held out 2 $100 bills and said, "Daddy wants you to tickle his tummy." While saying that, she pointed at her house. Honeybits replied, "No thanks, you keep that money." That was when the little girl's dad came out and said, "My wife died. She would tickle my tummy when I was sad. I'll pay you $200 to tickle me." Feeling bad, Honeybits ended up going into his house and tickling his tummy. She only took $100 and immediately left. To this day, she still feels bad and weird about it. What the fuck?
Sid once worked at a 12th century Montanbailey castle in England, which is essentially a big stone-walled fort with a fancy portico's gatehouse. While on a break and heading to the toilet, a confused young tourist with a kid stopped him and asked, "Excuse me, where's the castle?" Sid thought she was joking, but it quickly dawned on him that she wasn't. He said,
"You're already at the castle, miss."
And he gestured his hand to the surrounding buildings and the castle walls. She replied, "No, not this. The real castle." Sid insisted.
"This is the real castle."
She started talking slower like he was dumb. "No, the castle? Big tall thing with pointy turrets, towers, and a drawbridge." Sid explained again.
"Miss, this is the real castle. You're within its walls right now. We are standing in its central courtyard. That's the gatehouse you just walked through."
She then cut him off. "I don't believe this! You advertised a bloody castle, for fuck's sake! All that's here is a stone wall!" She later complained and demanded her money back, saying it didn't look anything like castles in films. When asked what film, she replied Disney.
One time in grade 5, Spinal Palm's friend was complaining that he felt sick throughout the school day, and at recess they were playing soccer. Someone ended up passing the ball to his friend when suddenly his friend went ghost white. He apparently couldn't hold it in anymore, and a stream of poop exploded down his shorts, covering his shoes and the soccer ball too. He kicked the ball to Spinal Palm before running to the toilet. As a reflex, Spinal Palm kicked the ball to stop it, but his friend's poop splattered all over his foot and clothes. Unfortunately, he'll never forget the smell of his friend's poop flying past his face.
Sidious's cringiest school memory happened on the last day of the school year. The whole school was in the auditorium listening to boring speeches, when suddenly the entire 5th grade came on stage to give a surprise hip-hop performance. Sidious's jaw dropped as a tidal wave of cringe swept over him. The 5th graders were performing the Flo Rida song, My House, except they rewritten the lyrics to be about school life. They called it My School. There was bad rapping and cheesy choreographed dancing. It was like an awkward, beautiful car crash. Sidious had never facepalmed so hard in his whole life.
Pringle was a very weird child. Unlike most kids, he loved eating his vegetables, especially spinach. One time, he went to a fancy dinner party at his aunt's house and impressed everyone by eating all his vegetables. For dessert, his aunt brought out a big chocolate cake with cherry frosting. Pringle didn't want any of this because he was super fussy about desserts. But his dad insisted he have some because otherwise it would be rude to the host. They ended up having a big argument at the table, and when Pringle started crying, his dad shouted,
"That's it! If you won't eat this cake, you're not allowed to have spinach for a week!"
This made Pringle cry even harder. It was the worst punishment he could ever imagine.
When Doopy was about 7 years old, she was at her grandmother's house during summer vacation. Doopy and her grandmother were sitting on the porch talking about life one summer afternoon when Doopy asked her grandma a pretty hilarious question. She looked at her grandma with a serious face and asked,
"Grandma, have you ever had children?"
She looked at Doopy and put her face in her palm. It took Doopy a few seconds to realize it was dumb.
Pandora, her younger sister, and their dad went to the Wizard World Comic-Con and were heading over to watch the Smash Brothers tournament. Just then, a guy wearing a Superman costume and a kilt sped by them on a unicycle while playing the bagpipes. As they watched, Pandora, her younger sister, and their dad rolled on the floor with laughter. Later, they saw the same guy, only that time he was dressed as Mario. It was the best thing Pandora had ever seen.
A couple of years ago, Emoji dated a Native American guy named A. One day, she was telling her aunt about him and noticed her aunt kept referring to him as Indian. Emoji kept correcting her, saying A was Native American. Her aunt said she wasn't sure what kind of Indian she meant. Then, to demonstrate, she put her hand over her mouth and did a racist impression of a Native American cry, and then impersonated a convenience store worker like a poo from The Simpsons. Emoji cringed so hard and wished she wasn't related to this woman.
In middle school, Legna had a very hot teacher who had curves in all the right places. During lunch, he was in a group of friends talking about her when he decided that he would make up a lie to make him look cool. So Legna told them that he had walked into class after school and grabbed her butt for a solid 30 seconds, and she didn't even care. Everyone he told went wild. It got to a point where everyone in school knew. He became really popular because of that lie. One day, someone told the hot teacher what Legna had said about her. She asked him if he'd said that, and he told her, "Yes, I did." She just laughed and told him to sit down. The best part was, nobody ever knew it was a lie until now.
When Shima was about 7 years old, she was staying at her best friend's house. They got bored and decided to start a fire in her driveway, just as it was getting, kind of dark. Her friend grabbed her dad's lighter that he kept outside, and she gathered some pine needles. They saw some rocks around her basketball ring and decided that they were just the right rocks for making a campfire. Shima gathered up the pine needles into a group, and they had the lighter ready. Her friend brought the rocks over one by one until they had a perfect little campfire circle. They started the fire and were happy with their creation. But They unfortunately were not smart enough to realize that the rocks were the only things keeping that basketball ring from falling over. And so, it fell and it smashed right into Shima's dad's truck. The alarm on the truck went off and they both screamed. Shima tried her best to put out the fire while her friend got the basketball ring off the car. Shima was still in the process of stomping out the fire when she saw him, the dad just standing there, staring at them.
Gergek and his friend Melon once went to a camp. He was originally meant to go to boot camp, but because of some knee problems he couldn't go and had to go to a different camp. When he went to boot camp, he would wear a red bandana over his mouth, ski goggles, and a black beanie on his head. Gergek thought that if he couldn't be at a boot camp, he could at least wear his gear. After 2 weeks, Melon got pissed off all of a sudden and said, "Will you take off that fucking beanie? Fuck this, we're done." That was the last time Gergek ever saw her.
Sid used to work at McDonald's when he was 17. It was a little after the lunch rush and he was working the front counter. There wasn't anyone ordering, but he noticed an older gentleman lingering near the counter. Sid decided to ask him if he needed help. What came out was,
"Are you gonna order something, or...?"
The man kind of smirked to himself and went up to the counter. The man asked if Sid knew who he was. He said no. Then the guy said, "I'm the person who signs your paychecks." He was the owner of the store Sid worked in, and he also owned the only other McDonald's in town.
A few semesters ago, Pandora had a college roommate who was the president of the school's only sorority. Things went okay at first, but then the roommates started holding sorority meetings in their dorm room. This would go on until 3 AM, making it impossible for Pandora to sleep. Their dorm was always full of frat boys, and no matter what Pandora said, the roommate refused to stop. Eventually, the sorority leader started bringing her boyfriend over and having sex in the middle of the open format dorm room in the middle of the day. They did this in front of a clear plate glass window, so Pandora's neighbors across the way had to buy eye bleach too. When Pandora and her other roommates confronted her about this, the evil roommate brushed it off, saying it was okay because they were quiet, as if that somehow made them invisible. It was the worst semester Pandora ever had.
Doopy was riding in a car with her mom when all of a sudden they began to hear someone laying on their horn. It lasted for about 3 blocks, with Doopy even saying,
Someone has an itchy horn hand.
Then they came up to a red light when a lady who had been the one honking at them pulled up beside them. She rolled down her window and started screaming at them for cutting her off, yelling how she was gonna beat their asses and how they were lucky her kid was in her car. Doopy's mom calmly said, "Fuck off. My kid's in the car too. Mind your own damn business." 2 swears was a record for Doopy's mom. Then the lady screamed at them some more when a cop came by and pulled her over. At first, Doopy and her mom were happy, but then the cop pulled them over too. He slapped her mom with a $400 ticket for cussing.
Ghost Toast was about 8 or 9 at about 11 p.m., which was past his bedtime. He walked into his parents' room. They asked him what he was doing, but he didn't respond. Ghost Toast then proceeded to pull his pants down and pee in the trash can. He was sleepwalking, but instead of waking up, his parents just laughed. They never let him forget the incident.
The dumbest thing anyone ever thought about in Nixium's family were guns. One summer evening, when he was camping with his family, the topic of guns came up. Nixium's brother made the remark that guns kill people. Their dad, being a smartass, decided to prove him wrong. He said, "I'll be right back." A few minutes later, their dad came out of his tent with a shotgun. He aimed it at his brother's face. Then, after a minute, lowered it. He then told Nixium's brother, "Guns are the means to kill. I choose whether or not to pull the trigger. The gun itself is sentient." Nixium's brother fainted while Nixium pissed himself.
While Pandora's friend was at her house for a sleepover, they decided to play on the Wii. As they played, Pandora swung her remote and it hit her friend in the face. Her face began to bleed, and Pandora's mum went to her room after hearing the commotion. When her mum asked what was going on, Pandora answered,
"She had her period on her face."
Her mum just looked at her before shrugging it off and walking away.
When he worked at a garden center, Dolan had to lift a bag of BioBlend compost, which was soil made of recycled greens and pig poop. which Dolan and his coworker lifted the bag over their heads to put it on a shelf. It ripped open on Dolan's end, spilling all over him. He had to be sprayed with a jet hose and couldn't get the smell of pig poo off him for a week.
A few years ago, when Ghost Toast was younger, there was a string of nights when he could hear someone or something inside his closet. For hours it would scratch and bang on the door from the inside. He was too scared to check what it was, so he stayed up until it went away, or until he unwillingly passed out from fear. Every morning he would check the closet, but nothing had moved and there weren't any scratch marks on the door. It would happen at the same time each night for several weeks, and then one night, there was nothing. It was gone. He hasn't heard it since then, and hopefully won't hear it again. When Hellbent was in middle school, he had a girlfriend for more than a year and a half, and he thought everything was going great. But after all that time, his girlfriend suddenly said she wanted to break up. When Hellbent asked her why, she said that she was an international super spy and her organization had told her to choose between her boyfriend or her job. It's probably worth noting that Kim Possible was a really popular show at the time. The very next week, she was dating some jock. So much for her spy work.
One evening at Anime Expo, Doopy and Ramona were talking about perceptions of convention goers.
When it comes down to it, most convention attendees are normal people expressing ourselves in safe, ordinary ways.
Doopy said. Just then, she saw a giant T-shaped Tetris piece running out of the building in a panic. It was being chased by a woman in a ripped-up, bloodied middle school uniform. The woman was swinging a kendo stick above her head, screaming, "Give me back my candy!" She chased the Tetris piece out of the building and down the street to the hotel. Doopy just calmly shrugged and said,
Well, some of us express ourselves in more normal ways than others.